Welcome to Black Journal. Black Journal is a communications outreach project of the Black Cultural Society of Nova Scotia. The history of education in Nova Scotia with regards to its relationship to the black community has a less than favorable history. There are many stories that can be told of the inequality of education provided for blacks for the past 100 years in this province. Recently, a school teacher in this area has set about to collect together the information and background on this particular issue and to present it in book form for the public to see and to evaluate. I have as my guest today the author of that document, Mrs. Eartha Monard. Welcome, Eartha.
Thank you.
Eartha, let's find out a little bit about yourself before we touch on the book. Where do you hail from? When did you come to Nova Scotia, and how did you get involved with Nova Scotia?
Basically, I came here toward the end of grade 8. I came from Jamaica.
Yes.
And I came in the early 70s where when due to social and political problems in Jamaica, my family moved here
Yes.
to Nova Scotia.
Yes.
And I came toward the end of grade 8 and attended Gorsbrook Junior High, later on Queen Elizabeth High School. Then I moved on to Dalhousie University, and I went to Mount St. Vincent University for my education degree. And in between, I studied at Laval University. I
Right.
majored in French, so I did some French immersion courses at Laval.
Yes.
And also, I spent a year at Université de la Sorbonne in Paris,
Yes.
and taught in New York for 3 years, and I've been back here now for 7 years.
Okay, now you covered a lot of time in that brief dissertation. However, what you have told me is that you have gone through the educational system in Nova Scotia.
In Nova Scotia, yeah.
And that gives you credentials to talk about it.
To talk about it, yeah.
Okay.
Both from as a student and as a teacher.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right, because now that you have have been in the teaching part of the program for a number of years and with a very credible degrees of Master of Education,
Yeah.
you certainly have the professional expertise to discuss this particular subject.
That's right.
So, with that known to our viewers, let's look at the document itself. What title have you given this document?
Well, it's basically racism in education, and it looks at black learners in Nova Scotia.
Okay, now, when did you first conceive in your mind that you want to tackle this project? It's no small matter.
Well, that's right. It isn't. Basically, when I came here, and I had really bad experiences in my junior high school year.
Yes.
And as a result, I knew that something had to be done. And just from seeing members of my own family who I thought had the same potential as I did, and for some reason or another just didn't make it through the education system. Likewise, I had friends with whom I attended school, and for some reason they just seemed to have fallen through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
And as a teacher, having had the privilege to talk to students and having students come to me and confide in me about various levels of frustration in the system,
Right.
I thought that it should be documented, and
Yes.
for some reason just to bring about some sort of awareness of, from the black perspective.
Now, did you attack this for the first time as a publishing project, or did you approach it in a smaller form before that?
Well, it certainly didn't start out that way. After doing the first chapter, I was encouraged by the professors involved. Basically, this is my master's project.
Okay, yes.
And I was encouraged by the professors involved to think in terms of, or to write in terms of having it published.
All right, okay.
Because there were some things that were that came out of it that surprised them, and they thought that everyone should have an opportunity to read something like this.
So you started out to write a paper for your professor.
Yeah.
And it caught fire.
Yes, it certainly
Okay.
did. It certainly
Okay,
did.
so when did you venture into the major project? What year did you start that now?
Yeah, 1991-92.
Yes.
1991-92, yeah.
Okay, now.
That was
you-
the final year of my working on my master's
Okay.
in education.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have a rather sizable document. I've gone through it.
Yeah,
It's
it is
rather
quite,
sizable.
yeah.
But you have broken it down in some major headings.
Yeah.
Okay, and one of the first ones I noticed, you dealt with the experience of education for blacks in Nova Scotia,
Yeah.
so that you would have something to use as examples of that. Tell us something about some of the stuff that you revealed and unveiled.
Well, basically, this document looks at the educational history from a broad perspective, looking at their history since they since they first arrived here.
Yes.
It looks at the African schools, the segregated schools, which occurred as a result of prior geographic residential segregation.
Yes.
And it also looks at integration, and it looks at the current situation in terms of what black learners get out of the system today.
Yes.
Looking back at the African schools, they were established mainly because there was a need for spiritual awareness, spiritual type of education.
Yes. Yes.
They weren't black learners that attended the African schools were not equipped with the necessary skills for mainstream life.
Right.
The type of education they received in the African schools were
Right.
basically to increase their spirituality.
They were church oriented, right?
Church oriented, yeah.
So the
Yeah.
content and the subject matter would be also
Yeah.
from the biblical perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
I see.
Exactly. And the schools that were established then were established under the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel.
Yes.
But it must be noted that prior to the establishment of these schools in 1784, there were already two schools already in existence. One, I believe, in Digby,
Yes.
where there was a somewhat of an ambitious superintendent who established a school,
Right.
and he had about 50 students, black
Right.
learners, attending that school. And in exchange for their education, they'd work 1 day a week on his farm.
Oh, yes.
And there was also a school that was established in Preston, where Catherine Abernathy
Yes.
taught school there in a small log schoolhouse cabin.
Right.
And there she had 20 students. So just given these examples, you can see that blacks have always wanted an education.
Yes.
The fact that they'd work 1 day a week because they didn't have the financial means.
Right.
They worked 1 day a week in Digby to get some kind of education.
Of course, yes.
And then in Preston, they took upon themselves to build a schoolhouse
Right.
where they could gain some form of education.
Of course. With the church-oriented type education system, it seems to me that would be very restrictive in content and more intended to bring people towards a certain faith and a certain belief rather than to academics by itself.
Well, for example, Catherine Abernathy, when
Yes.
she at one point later on, the school that she taught in was took over by the SPG.
Oh, yes.
And because she tended to somewhat stray from the things that she was supposed to be teaching, they
Right.
had withheld her pay.
Can you imagine?
So it's stating that
Yes.
she was embracing some sort of like
Yes,
strange
yes.
religious
You weren't
tenets.
following the faith.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
see.
So it was quite restrictive,
Yes.
and they had to follow a certain guidelines
Yes.
in terms of what they teach in these schools.
So it was certainly the integration of school and church.
Yeah, exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
The segregated school system, when did that come about approximately, and what was the rationale behind that?
Well, the rationale behind that was that the white families did not want their children to mix with the black, well, they called them Negroes at that
Yes,
time,
yes.
because they felt that the Negroes had just gotten out of slavery and they were concerned about their own children's morals.
Oh, okay.
So they really did not want their children to mix with the black. But the segregation of schools existed even before it was written on paper.
Oh, yes.
Because of the geographical residential segregation. But it was later written and later adopted by the Nova Scotia legislators.
Yes.
In that they did not want both races to mix.
And that remained on the books for quite some many decades, didn't it?
It certainly did. It certainly
Yes.
did. Up until 1954, I believe.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. We'd already gone to the moon then, and we're still having a segregated school system.
Exactly.
Now, the integration of the school, the black students and the white students across Nova Scotia, what were some of the things that you identified with respect to that movement?
Well, integration of schools, and it's such a nice word to use, but once they got in through the doors, that's really where segregation began.
Yes.
Because for the most part, there were two types of schools. You had the regular school system,
Yes.
and then you had what was called special education.
Yes.
And for the most part, blacks seemed to end up into the special classes.
Right.
And as a result of the education system not being prepared to accept blacks into the regular school system, blacks were not given the same educational opportunities, and that's due in part because of the Eurocentricity of the curriculum.
Yes.
Blacks could not relate, and therefore they were labeled and put into special classes.
There would probably be some attitude on the part of the white teaching faculty that blacks could not master or achieve education beyond a very limited level in any case. Would that have been the case many times?
That certainly existed, and it still exists today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, the curriculum certainly wasn't theirs as far as identification is concerned, the history and so on. Were there any particular instances that occurred that you are aware of that brought home how difficult this would be for a black student?
Well, it's difficult because of the fact that they're not reflected in the curriculum.
Yes.
They are not. They walk through the school doors. They're not reflected in the school corridors. They're not reflected in the posters that are on the wall. They're not reflected in the books that they read.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, that has a damaging effect on one's self-esteem.
Yes. Now, the parents must have at some time become aware of the failings and shortcomings of this system to which their kids are being subjected. Did they raise any observations or take any steps to try to correct this?
Oh, certainly. Ever since their arrival, blacks in this province have always taken a stand on education. They sometimes didn't have the means, and I've documented various petitions that came out of various communities in the when they first came here.
Yes.
And it's really interesting because I came across a petition that was documented approximately 147 years ago.
Yes.
And it was signed by the first Upshaw that was in the province.
Okay.
And that came out of Windsor. And it's really interesting now because, as you know, Robert Upshaw, who's the executive director of the Black Learners Advisory Committee, he's still fighting for some of those same things that were being requested. 140.
So the Upshaws haven't let them something drop.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you have anything that you could quote for us in your document?
Possibly.
Because sometimes just hearing the wording itself would be enough to cause people to be so much more aware and informed. But even with that, did they take a stand which was against the government or against the system itself?
They took a stand against well, okay, here's that.
Perhaps you can just say off the top of your head in essence, what it means.
Could you rephrase that question?
Okay, just in essence, what were they really taking issue with? Was it the content?
The educational opportunities.
Yes.
Basically, they were not being given the same educational privileges, educational rights as the white population.
Right.
Oftentimes, they've had to conduct schools in buildings that were deplorable, schools without plumbing, heating facilities, and at times the materials, they did not have sufficient materials to work with.
Right, okay.
And so they were taking a stand against things like that. And it's sort of like similar to what's going on today because we do have fine, right now we're allowed in the same building, but at the same time we don't have the equal privileges.
Okay.
We're still not being reflected the way we should be.
Right.
We're still not given the same equal opportunity as the white population.
Yes. Would the teaching level of the teachers in the, let's say, segregated school system have been as equal to that of the regular school system, or would there have been a lesser teaching level?
Well, from what I found out, it was of a lesser standard in the segregated schools for blacks.
Yes.
In that in a lot of our cases, blacks did not have the same, black teachers did not have the same qualifications.
Yes.
So even that in itself, to impart the kind of knowledge that you're supposed to be imparting and not having the background yourself.
Right.
I had quotes from a teacher like Boston King,
Yes.
who apparently he was a preacher as well, and who quoted that he was fine once he had to deal with blacks, but once the white people came into his church, he felt somewhat embarrassed because he didn't have the
Yes.
amount of education that they
Yes.
had.
Yes.
So it was interesting to find out things like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, now, here in more recent years, there are probably still initiatives being taken by black parents, because I see black parent associations formed and that sort of thing. What sort of issues are they now addressing, or what ways are they addressing it differently from the past?
Well, for one thing, there have been like numerous initiatives from 1954 to present day.
Yes.
The only difference now is that there are some initiatives that are coming from the government,
Yes.
as well as other institutions, but only because of the initiatives of the black community,
Yes.
because of their efforts and advocacy. We're seeing more and more initiatives today.
Yes.
There are various initiatives, for example, the Black Educators Association,
Yes.
the Black Learners Advisory Committee, and most recently the African Education Project, which I
Right.
think some good things are going to come out of that.
Yes, that was just launched on Saturday, I believe, officially.
Yeah,
Yes.
some good things are going to come out of that. But it's really too bad that in 1994 that we still need separate institutions, separate
Yes.
organizations to address educational needs for
Yes.
blacks. Like it's a shame, I think, that we're not reflected in the mainstream curriculum as opposed to something being set aside as an additional type of thing.
Yes, a supplement.
Yeah.
While you were yet going through the school system, were you aware of, or were you a victim of, the streaming system?
No, but I could have been. I remember in grade 9, I remember being encouraged, or rather discouraged, to take the courses that I had wanted to take. I wanted to become a nurse initially,
Yes,
so I
yes.
needed the science. And I was always interested in languages, so I
Right.
was, signed up for English, Spanish, French, and everything
Yes,
else.
yes.
And I remember being told that, it was just too heavy, that I really should reconsider not taking.
Yes.
And I insisted, and here I am today. I
Yes.
succeeded.
Were you ever said it's for your own good that they were giving you this advice?
Yeah, yes,
I see.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. And just from talking to other students or seeing students that I know are capable,
Yes.
and seeing them being pushed toward special classes.
General, yes.
yeah. And like I said, it happened in my own family, where very capable members of my own family were directed toward special classes.
Yes, and in that particular context, the streaming system, by the time a student realizes that they've been victimized, it seems that sometimes it's too late for them to regroup and get ready for a college education.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. Even within the Caribbean community,
Yes.
I've had parents who call me up just to talk about this, because they come here from the Caribbean,
Yes.
and they don't realize that there's a duality
Yes.
that
Yes.
exists here, and before they know it, their kids graduating from high school, and they can't get into university,
Yes.
and because they haven't been taking the right
Yes.
courses. But had those parents been informed, things might have been different.
What were some of the reactions you got when you decided you wanted to become also a competent language teacher?
Well, I had a lot. In fact, when I graduated university, when I graduated as a teacher,
Yes.
I didn't think, as I hadn't had a black teacher since I came here, and I thought, well, I don't see any here. Obviously, blacks don't teach here. I didn't think that I'd ever get a job in this province working as a black teacher. So I went to New York, and I taught there for 3 years, and my self-esteem improved. I grew professionally and personally, and decided to come back here and tackle it.
Yes.
But I didn't think that I'd ever get a job teaching, because I hadn't had a black teacher myself, even though I'd attended a high school where a great percentage of the population of the student was black.
I rather doubt that you were the only black in your French schooling in France either.
Oh my goodness! It was just such a refreshing thing for me to do, just to go there, because I was running into black students who spoke like 4, 5, 6 different languages, and somehow that gave me some sort of a sense of like here. When I talk to people and they find out that I speak French, it's sort of like such a big deal. But then I was running into people that spoke 6, 7, 8 different languages, and it certainly was not a big deal there. And I'm talking about black people. It was just incredible. Yeah.
When you had finally made your way through all of this wall of information and started to put it into some sort of resemblance of order in that, what sort of things, what sort of revelations and conclusions were you drawing as a result of this material?
Well, I was looking at the inequality, how blacks were being denied equal access to educational opportunities, and basically it boils down to racism, and it has existed. It existed throughout the African schools. It certainly existed throughout the segregated schools in integration and to current day.
If a person in support of the system was to say it wasn't done intentionally, it was, inadvertently occurred, what would be your response to that?
Well, it was initially done intentionally.
Yes.
Because blacks were considered unequal to their white counterparts.
Yes.
And since then, it's just embedded and entrenched into the system. Maybe now might not be considered intentionally, but it certainly was back then. And today, one can say that there are those who intend to maintain the status quo.
Yes.
So there's still some sort of intentional movement on the part of the dominant structure.
As Robert would say, it's systemic now.
It's systemic. It's systemic. Yeah.
Okay.
It's called institutionalized racism.
Okay. Now, in your view, what are some of the steps and some of the attitudinal changes that have to take place to correct this problem?
Well, it's certainly institutional racism is not going to go away by itself, and I think that various corrective measures are needed. And to start, one needs to, and I know it needs to be legislated. Attitudes are not going to change because the black community wants it to, or because the government wants it to. People in our society seem to respond well to rules and regulations and policies and things like that. So I think it has to be legislated before we can see any sort of like meaningful change. But again, we have to start with education. What
Particular areas would you see as being the ones that must first be addressed to bring this about? What particular behaviors or patterns existing right now should be stressed?
Well, the practices in the schools today must be changed.
Yes.
We need to see more role models in the school. We need to see ourselves reflected in the curriculum. Yes. It's really difficult because blacks do not have the same sort of expectations as whites even today. As Robert Upshaw, I was talking to him a while back, and he stated that he cannot walk into a building and assume that it's owned by a black person.
Right.
So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yes.
There's still an awful lot of work to be done. And certainly we're starting to see some movement toward change, but we still have a long way to go.
There are those who may have difficulty relating the academic dilemma of blacks in Nova Scotia over the past 100 years or more as it relates to their economic state, as it relates to their employment state, and even as it relates to their social state. What is your feelings on that?
Well, I think if they were given the same equal educational opportunities, I think the employment, the economic state would be different today. They were they had a bad start.
Yes.
They just were not given equal educational opportunities, and over the years they've had negative feelings toward the education system,
Yes.
and those feelings have been internalized.
Yes.
And as a result, today, we're seeing what we've developed. What we have right now is the result of what one could say a racist heritage.
Yes,
So
yes.
that blacks do not benefit in the same way from the education system as the whites, as their white counterparts.
Yes. Now you have a sizable document.
Yeah.
It's still in the what phase do they call it? The manuscript phase.
Pre-publishing phase.
Pre-publishing phase. Now, what are your ambitions beyond this, and what would you like to see happen now?
Well, I'd like to see this used as some sort of a catalyst for change.
Yes.
Like, it's certainly not the answer to all the problems that we have right now, but I think it would bring about some sort of awareness. I think it's important to, in order to understand the black learner today,
Yes.
you really have to understand the black learner's history.
Yes.
And I've got, I think I've got things fairly documented
Yes.
in a manner that is comprehensible. And in order to bring about any sort of meaningful change,
You need
we have
something
to
start from.
Yeah,
Yes.
and we really have to go back to history.
If someone viewing this program was to take an interest in what you have there and would hope to see it develop beyond the pre-publishing stage into the publishing stage, who would they contact and how?
They'd contact the Black Cultural Center, and they'd talk to George Borden.
Okay.
That's where we'd go from here.
Yes. Okay. So we will keep that document on handy, and we'll expect to hear from someone who's interested in seeing this document being published, and perhaps using it as the foundation for initiatives that need to be taken.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think it would be worthwhile. It looks not only at the educational history, but it also looks at education today as it
Yes.
exists, and it also takes a look at multiculturalism and anti-racist education, the
Yes.
differences between the two,
Yes.
and how multiculturalism, anti-racist education could be used in the school system, not only for the benefit of the black student,
Yes.
but for all.
Yes.
For all.
Eartha, thank you so much for coming on the program. I know it was a very difficult thing for you to undertake these days.
Yes.
I thank you so much. I know the viewers have learned from what you have told them, and hopefully we'll make this a published product very soon. You've been watching Black Journal, and we'll see you in 7 days.